It's October 1919, and British Indian troops are still fighting insurgent tribes in the remote region of Waziristan. This revolt has been going on since May, when the Third Anglo-Afghan War and Afghanistan's fight for independence began. Hi, I'm Jesse Alexander and welcome to the Great War. The Third Anglo-Afghan War of May 1919 is a fascinating conflict that we just had to cover. But it happened to occur in a rather remote area for detailed media coverage 100 years ago. As such, this episode is a bit shorter, as we couldn't access as many photos or film reels as we usually do. Anyway, Afghanistan had long been a hotspot in the Anglo-Russian struggle for influence in the region. The country's foreign policy had been under British control since 1879, but cracks began to show in this arrangement during the First World War. The Emir Habibullah Khan hoped for a Central Powers victory to achieve independence. The Germans and Ottomans did all they could to encourage him to join them, including a German mission to Afghanistan, and a reference to an independent Afghanistan in the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. But, despite the pressure to attack British India, he remained neutral. In February 1919, Habibullah lobbied the British for independence. He wrote to the Viceroy of India and asked for cooperation in obtaining international recognition of the absolute liberty, freedom of action, and perpetual independence of Afghanistan at the Paris Peace Conference. But despite the Viceroy's personal sympathy, the British government were not interested. Habibullah had gambled that neutrality would bring independence, but this gamble had failed. And on February 20th, he was assassinated. After a brief power struggle, his nephew Amanola became emir and inherited a war-related political crisis. Amanola declared independence April 13th and decided to attack British India, though there is some debate about his reasoning. Most likely, it was a combination of wanting to force Afghan independence, strong anti-British forces in his government, and military miscalculation. Amanola's May declaration of war read in part, "I proclaim to all of you, the truthful subjects of my royal person, that the treacherous and deceitful English government has been, since a long time, practicing with diabolical treachery and fraud many shameful oppressions upon us. I call upon my pious and brave royal army, and upon all my faithful subjects, to wage jihad in the path of God with their life and property." The declaration went on to condemn British treatment of both Muslims and Hindus in India. Now, the Afghan regular army, which now prepared to invade India, boasted about 50,000 men and about 280 guns, some of which were modern German designs and some of which were obsolete. On the whole, it was not a crack force, according to British General Molesworth. Afghan regular units were ill-trained, ill-paid, and probably under strength. The cavalry was little better than indifferent infantry mounted on equally indifferent ponies. Critically, the Afghans hoped the frontier tribes on the British side of the border would revolt, since their skill in irregular warfare might tip the scales. British forces in the region faced some real difficulties too. The Indian Army had been weakened by its heavy losses overseas, and its soldiers were anxious to demobilize. Much of the country was also in a state of unrest against British rule, especially after the massacre of unarmed civilians at Amritsar in April. The region was also hot, remote, and a logistical nightmare, as General Munro reported. India, and especially the frontier region, is a country ill-provided with those amenities of civilization which, in Western Europe, go so far to mitigate the discomforts of a campaign. And, coming as it did at the hottest season of the year, this campaign inevitably imposed severe hardships on the troops employed. All the same, the British enjoyed clear military superiority, and the use of motor transport allowed them to move troops quickly. So, the Afghan army had invaded British India in the hopes the frontier tribes would join it and force the British to grant independence. It was a risky move, but the die had now been cast. The Afghan army was to advance on three fronts: through the Khyber Valley, into Waziristan, and in Baluchistan towards Quetta and the Zob Valley. Fighting began in the Khyber Pass on May 3rd, as Afghan forces under Saleh Muhammad Khan struck prematurely. Hostilities officially began on May 6th, and Muhammad's forces occupied key water sources near the village of Bagh. British counterattacks at first failed, but finally drove the Afghan troops back May 11th, using aircraft to bomb and strafe the retreating column. The British then advanced into Afghanistan and took the town of Dhaka, and held off counterattacks with heavy losses. But behind British lines, many local militiamen of the Khyber Rifles deserted and joined the Afghans. Meanwhile, an uprising in Peshawar, led by the Afghan postmaster, was quickly put down. Putting their air power to good use, the British bombed Jalalabad and Kabul, destroying the country's only machine shop and the tomb of a former emir. An outraged Amanola wrote to the British, "It is a matter of great regret that the throwing of bombs by Zeppelins on London was denounced as a most savage act, and the bombardment of places of worship and sacred spots was considered a most abominable operation, while now we see with our own eyes that such operations were a habit which is prevalent amongst all civilized peoples of the West." In Waziristan, Brigadier General Eustace feared the militias holding the nearby Tochi Valley would desert and ordered the forward posts abandoned. Almost immediately, the local tribes seized abandoned weaponry and rose in revolt. By May 26th, Afghan commander and future emir Muhammad Nadir Khan had reached Tal. He surprised the British by using a difficult route that was still passable for the elephants carrying his artillery. He laid siege to the weakly defended fort but did not storm it, and this was likely a missed opportunity. On the Baluchistan front, the British advanced into Kandahar province and attacked the Afghan fort at Spin Baldak on May 27th. Gurkha, Punjabi and British troops launched the assault under cover of a Western Front-style creeping barrage, and ferocious hand-to-hand fighting took place. The Afghan commander, Dawood Shah, was severely wounded, and of 600 defenders, some 400 were killed. But by late May, Amanola had asked for an armistice. But despite these talks, operations continued, and on June 1st, a British Indian force under Reginald Dyer arrived to relieve Tull after marching 30 kilometers in 12 hours. Nadir Khan sent him a message proposing that they halt the fighting during negotiations, but Dyer had not yet heard the news and instead responded, "My guns will give an immediate reply, and a further reply will be sent by the divisional commander, to whom the letter has been forwarded." The Afghans decided to pull back rather than waste lives. So, by early June, the Afghan invasion had been repulsed, and the British had assembled 100,000 troops for an advance on Jalalabad. But the British were also anxious to end the fighting before the tribal revolts could spread, and on June 3rd, the armistice was signed, just as a cholera epidemic struck British troops. Now, both sides ended up signing the Treaty of Rawalpindi on August 8th. Britain agreed to give up total control of Afghan foreign policy, but stopped paying the Afghans subsidy, as Chief British Negotiator Alfred Hamilton Grant confirmed in a letter. The said treaty and this letter leave Afghanistan officially free and independent in its internal and external affairs. The Durand Line, until now the disputed border, was agreed to by both sides, and further talks about Afghan-British friendship and Afghan-Bolshevik relations were also planned for 1920. For the Afghans, a tactical defeat had turned into a strategic victory. Now, some on the British side were unhappy with the terms, given the advantageous military situation, but Britain could not afford to continue the war because of its difficulties in India. It also wanted to preserve a stable Afghanistan to prevent Bolshevik influence from spreading there from Central Asia. In the end, the war had far-reaching effects, both in Afghanistan and in British India. Independence had been won, but Amanola realized the need for reform, a policy that would pit him against his conservative opponents. The British position in the region had been weakened by the collapse of the militia system and the loss of an Afghan client state, and it became clear they would have to garrison the area more heavily. Air power had proved itself as a force multiplier in the remote area, and military theorists took note of its success. But the British were not done fighting on the frontier, and the tribal revolts in Waziristan would drag on well into 1920. As usual, you can find all our sources for this episode in the video description below. If you want to support our channel, you can help us on Patreon or buy our merchandise, and the links are in the video description below as well. I'm Jesse Alexander, and this is The Great War 1919, a production of Real-Time History and the only YouTube history channel that almost felt like it was watching the news in 2019 while writing this episode about 1919.